So hello, my name is Karen. I am a student in political science at Université Laval and a member of the Modern Treaties Implementation Research Project. Well, I considered that it's important to measure well-being in treaty contexts, given our expectations as to what modern treaties embody and what they're meant to do. So these negotiated agreements provide a means for improving the well-being of Indigenous peoples by increasing their opportunities for self-reliance through their political and economic development. Modern treaties are expected to achieve these outcomes by establishing specific rights, including surface and mineral rights, but also by clarifying the obligations of each treaty signatory, so the federal, provincial, or territorial governments, but also the Indigenous group. Now, by stating these rights and obligations, modern treaties offer a means of resolving disputes over resource extraction and also increasing Indigenous control over their lands and resources. Now, where these negotiated agreements are respected and recognized, they provide a mutually agreed upon framework for sharing land and authority with non-Indigenous peoples, but also providing the means for Indigenous peoples to protect and strengthen their culture, including their language, knowledge, and practices through various initiatives and programs that are developed and implemented by and for Indigenous peoples. So modern treaties are expected to offer stable and predictable, as well as secure environments that should foster public and private investments. And by doing that, they're expected to enhance employment opportunities, to contribute to the development of local Indigenous businesses that can also profit from greater economic activities on their lands, and also ultimately by increasing the income of Indigenous households. Now, for all these reasons, but also because treaties represent the beginning of a new intergovernmental relationship, one which is founded on trust and respect, modern treaties are considered as transformative and truly powerful tools for reconciliation. Now, for modern treaties to deliver on their promise to enhance well-being of Indigenous signatories, they do so through institutions. So these institutions are created and they operate in accordance with the objectives and purposes that are laid out in these agreements. As such, they play a really important role by increasing and advancing the possibilities for Indigenous aspirations and interests, and also through the work that they perform on a daily basis, particularly those of the land-based co-management boards and their impact review boards. These institutions are crucial in the implementation of modern treaties, and they ensure that they really deliver on the promises that these contain, which is essentially to enhance the well-being of Indigenous communities. But there have been questions and serious concerns which have been expressed by Indigenous signatories about the implementation of modern treaties. So the questions that have been raised is how and to what degree these agreements have successfully achieved their goals. Studies have also highlighted that the ability of modern treaties to enhance the living conditions, the prosperity, and the overall well-being of Indigenous signatories can be contested and even can be questioned, especially if they're regarded as a means of enabling extractive resource development on Indigenous lands. So how can we measure well-being? When considering the ways and the tools we can use to assess the impact and implementation of well-being, it's first useful to consider what it actually means. So what we understand by well-being. It's been defined in the academic literature as a positive and sustainable state that allows individuals, groups, or nations to thrive and flourish, and also as a social, economic, and political conditions that allow people to lead fulfilling and enjoyable lives. There have been multiple efforts worldwide to assess Indigenous well-being, and amongst these, we have Australia's Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage Framework, which was developed by the Australian government in response to the official Decade on Reconciliation with Indigenous Australians. Now, this framework was meant to offer a means of assessing how and also to what extent the government could achieve, I quote, practical reconciliation, which for them is understood as statistical equality between the standards of living of non-Indigenous peoples and Indigenous Australians in terms of health, housing, education, and also employment. In New Zealand, they have something called a Living Standards Framework, which focuses on the collective impact of policies on intergenerational well-being. Now, measuring the impacts of modern treaties on Indigenous well-being is quite complex. It's neither easily achieved using existing information or easily done through research. And this is so for several reasons. For one, every treaty is different. It's tailored to the particular geographies, Indigenous cultures and histories of the signatories, of the Indigenous signatories. The agreements have also been signed at different times and contexts. And in addition to that, the implementation varies significantly, both across agreements, but also with respect to their content, with some components of modern treaties enforced to a greater degree than others. What I consider perhaps most problematic is what I would say is the uneven understanding of what these agreements actually mean and how each party is expected to partake in their implementation. Now in Canada, if we think about assessing well-being, there exists one tool called the Community Wellbeing Index, which has been used to measure socioeconomic well-being for communities over time, both in comparison to their own evolution over time, but also with respect to non-Indigenous standards of living. However, this is a tool that was primarily designed for research. It's a score which ranges from 0 to 100 and comprises 4 components. So education, employment, income, and housing. As it stands, this research tool, this research device wasn't developed and shouldn't really be used to assess the impacts of modern treaties because that's not what it was intended to do. And it really only provides a partial portrait, a very limited understanding of components of Indigenous well-being. Another current and quite inspiring initiative that's being put forward is developed by the Nisga'a government, which concerns the quality of life. So a quality of life framework and also a quality of life survey that's currently being implemented. So the outcomes of this will be very interesting to explore in the upcoming years. So when we think about the limits of the types of measures that are currently being used to assess well-being, well, it's interesting to look more closely at the problems that we encounter when trying to use existing information, particularly in terms of quantitative data to determine how modern treaties have impacted on the lives of Indigenous communities and also of individuals. It helps us understand what the struggles have been in terms of research as well. In particular, it's good to examine some specific components of these challenges, namely the availability, the accessibility, and also the quality of the quantitative data that is currently available. Now, for one, the identification of Indigenous individuals in Canada has been considered inconsistent and is therefore quite problematic. While there's really a vast amount of data that concerns non-Indigenous peoples in Canada that can be disaggregated, that means considered with regards to different identity markers like age, sex, and geography, the same can't be necessarily done with non-Indigenous peoples, given that this marker of an Indigenous identity isn't always available on the data that is produced. Also, if we consider administrative data, which is gathered by government agencies and also organizations from the populations they serve, it's really quite difficult to access, but also to use. Now, the reliability and the quality of this data has been known to vary quite significantly from one data source to the other, but also across time. The data, it's good to remind ourselves, has been collected to meet a department's reporting, compliance, and accountability obligations. And this data, therefore, isn't necessarily useful to determine whether or to what extent a given program or policy or initiative has impacted on the lives of those it was intended to serve. In addition to that, they don't always have consistent methodological standards like data dictionaries or a standardized means of collecting and processing or storing the data, which makes their use also quite problematic. Now, accessing and sharing this type of data is also very regulated. It's complex given the laws that are set to protect personal information and the privacy of Canadians in general. So as a result, it's both hard to get and it's also very hard to use. Moving forward, it is important to consider all of the issues pertaining to data sovereignty and the right of Indigenous peoples to both possess and use and control the data that concern them. So building partnerships is really capital when considering doing research, whether with this type of data or with any other source of information that concerns Indigenous peoples. And also going the more qualitative route could also provide some very interesting and very innovative sources of information to truly understand what well-being can mean in a treaty context and how these treaties may have enhanced Indigenous self-reliance and control over their lives, and therefore also enhance their well-being.